A lot of you have been asking why I haven't done an Everything Wrong with video for Second Son, since I have shown my disdain for it in my other videos. Well, the obvious answer is that it already exists, and I'm not going to make an identical video to somebody else because our viewpoints are so similar. So instead, I'm just going to give you guys the nitty-gritty on why exactly I dislike it so much, and so I can be more subjective and honest with myself. If you're someone who does like Second Son, good for you. I'm not looking to insult you or make you think that you're wrong for enjoying it. This is simply my own opinion. If you disagree with me, that's fine. You have a right as a human being to disagree with me. First, some context. I only got into the inFAMOUS series because of the PlayStation Network hack of 2011. I figured that a game Sony was giving away for free couldn't be all that great, but with some recommendations from some friends, I gave the first game a shot. Lo and behold, I was hooked. Electric superpowers, the plot, the characters, the twist, give me more. A few months later, and the sequel releases, and I begged the crap out of my dad to get it for me because I was a minor with no job. Turn everything the first game did up to 11. More characters, better graphics, motion capture, deeper plot, more powers, and two of the most bittersweet endings to a video game that stuck with me so bad I immediately ran off to write a fanfiction that I'm still working on nearly 7 years later. And then comes Second Son. I'll admit that when the first teaser trailer dropped during E3, I was actually looking forward to Second Son. Sure, at first I couldn't tell what the game was, but some guy blowing stuff up against a regime controlling the population, and I was totally down for that. The second I heard Troy Baker's voice, I was practically sold. Then the title pops up, and that was all I needed to see to have everything I just felt about this cool-looking game go right out the window. Second Son, in big bright letters, with inFAMOUS being the subtitle of the game. The main brand of the franchise reduced to something you barely even notice, pushed to the side to usher in something new, when just the syntax of the title of the game tells me exactly how this game relates to the inFAMOUS series as a whole. I knew this was going to be a setup for disappointment. Then came all the questions that everyone else had. Who's this new kid? Why are there still conduits if this is after the good ending? Is Cole alive somehow? What is this new faction that seems to be hunting down conduits? And it turns out that we were told the answer to all of these things before the game even came out in interviews and trailers. Simple answers to simple questions. The truth is that there's almost no depth to Second Son. It's the equivalent to a kiddie pool, ankle high, and if you're lucky it might come up to your calves on the far side. This is the root of my problem with Second Son. The story, the quality of the narrative, the characters, the world building. All of it feels like the developers put incomplete thoughts on a wheel and spun it to see what would go in the game. The gameplay element, however, is fine for the most part. There are still a few things that bother me, but overall it feels like an inFAMOUS game. We got superpowers, we got sandboxing, we got city traversal, we got some side quests to do. The gameplay is probably what keeps me from hating this game entirely and grinding it up into mulch for my lawn. To start off, let's get my biggest problem with this game out of the way, just so you guys can understand where I'm coming from. You remember playing the first two inFAMOUS games? You know, the one with Cole as the main protagonist? You remember getting to know him for 2.5 games? His friends, his personality, his flaws, his quirks? Remember trying to save the world from the all-powerful beast that was going to destroy the world if you didn't stop it? Remember having to make the choice between sacrificing Cole and all the conduits to save humanity, or instead murdering Cole's best friend so that he can become the beast and ensure the conduits live to keep some form of humanity from dying off? Second Son takes all of that, uses it as toilet paper after taking the runniest dump, and then wipes it all over your face. Second Son takes 7 years after inFAMOUS 2, after Cole has already given up his life and all the lives of every conduit in the world to trade for normal humans to survive the plague that was going to wipe out all life. But for some reason, there are conduits still alive. Well, okay, I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. Maybe there's a good explanation for it. But guess what? Sucker Punch didn't even bother to give a valid answer to this paradox in their narrative. But Ziv, I hear you say, they did give us an answer. To which I would like to know, which one are you referring to? Yeah, they couldn't decide on which excuse to stick with, so they made up 4 different reasons, all of which make no fucking sense. The first reason they give us was that the conduits who are alive during Second Son had some sort of resistance to the RFI, the device Cole used to cure the plague, which also had the side effect of killing everyone that was a conduit. Here's why that's a dumb reason. How can a species have a resistance to something if there was no time to adapt to such a resistance? It takes generations for evolution to go about preparing for this. This is how people with sickle cell anemia are resistant to malaria. This is how the birds that migrated to the Galapagos Islands eventually became different species from each other in order to develop beaks that could help them forage for different various types of food. This is how our bodies learn to fight off diseases with vaccines. Hell, this is how the flu becomes resistant to older vaccines every single year. There can't be any conduits that had a resistance to the RFI because the RFI was a one-and-done type of deal. There was no time to adapt to it. Cole pressed the switch, and all the conduits died. The second excuse they tried to pass off was that some conduits survived because of their relative distance from where the RFI was used. So let me get this straight. The RFI went off in New Marais, the fictional version of New Orleans, and it releases a curtain of energy that covers the entire planet. Conduits were dying in India, Egypt, and China, but a few kids from Seattle, New Jersey, and Delaware had no problems? Didn't even feel a little twinge of pain from it, huh? Oh, and a lot of people try to come back at me by saying that obviously the conduits that survived are the ones that didn't have their powers activated. Do you know how genetics work? A person is a conduit from the day they are born. It is a mutated gene that these people were born with. It doesn't matter if the gene is dormant or active, it still exists in the human body. It just isn't producing proteins that actually provide people with their powers. We even have an example of Cole being extraordinary before he even gets his powers. He survived being hit head-on by a truck and walked out of the hospital the next morning with no broken bones whatsoever. Also, if the RFI only worked on activated conduits, then in theory it would have only killed people in small parts of the United States, since the ray sphere was only used in New Marais and Empire City, and any other conduits that were activated by the beast. In other words, there were no active conduits on any other continent in the world, but people in the Far East were dropping like flies. So please stop trying to come up with more bad excuses because even Sucker Punch wasn't dumb enough to offer that as an argument. I might also say that I have a degree in biology. I took a college genetics class. Twice! I know what I'm talking about. These appeared in the Cole's Legacy and Paper Trail DLC, which by the way, I'll have something to say about each of those later. One of these was the argument that the DUP was engineering the conduit gene to reappear in normal people so that the government wouldn't shut down the organization. My answer to that is, if that's true, why did the DUP have a job in the first place? Back before the RFI was used, the DUP was just an idea. It hadn't even been created or funded yet until a year after Infamous 2. Until then, Augustine was trying to round up conduits with minimal help while the military went around murdering the ones she couldn't capture because they had powers. That, and there was no panic about the government shutting down the DUP until after they had supposedly caught all the conduits in America. Did no one proofread this? And finally, we have the last attempt at trying to make Second Son remotely possible in Infamous canon, and I'll admit that if I had to pick one of these as the least stupid, it would have to be this one. According to Raymond Wolf, the reason why the conduits are still around is because when Cole used the RFI to cure the plague, he never actually got rid of it. Since the plague is just radiation poisoning, all it did was change it into a different kind of radiation, one that was benign for the most part. Instead of killing humans, it mutated them into conduits, eventually giving them powers. This, I'll admit, kinda makes sense from a fictional point of view. However, this is just a hypothesis, and he sends Delson out to get proof from the DUP. When you find a recording of Augustine explaining her viewpoint on the matter, she only says that the conduits did survive the RFI. Well, no shit, lady, why else would we be talking about this? But if we were to approach Raymond's hypothesis as fact, which there is no proof to support it, my only problem with it is that if it turned the plague into an anti-plague, wouldn't it have created far more conduits in the Empire City and New Marais areas? You know, where the ray sphere had been used and therefore had a greater concentration of the radiation. Augustine also mentions that the RFI had killed 90% of all the conduits in the world, so she also offers the natural resistance argument at the same time. So let's do some math. We know that the DUP housed 500 conduits in Curtain K. And at that point, the government was going to dissolve the organization for having done their job exceptionally well to the point that keeping it around would have been a sinkhole of taxpayers' dollars. Augustine also mentions that in the 7 years since Infamous 2, that half of the conduits who survived the RFI were killed by the military and violent, frightened humans. Now we have 1,000 people who survived the RFI. If that's 10% of all conduits, then there were 10,000 conduits in the whole world during the first 2 games in the series. My point with all this is that if 5% of the conduit population is alive in Second Son, why are there not more than that when there is radiation floating above the entire continent of North America to instigate such a change in people? That is 7 years of constant bombardment by irradiated microparticles. You guys ever play Fallout? Damn near every enemy in that game is mutated from the radiation from the nukes going off after several years. You guys ever get an x-ray at the dentist or doctor and they put that thick vest over you? That's because even that small amount of gamma radiation they put in your body can give you cancer after so much exposure. You're telling me that in 7 years, only 500 people out of 300 million people in the country are conduits? Like I said, out of all these, if I had to pick one, I'd go with the anti-plague theory. But it has just as many plot holes in it as all the others. Not to mention that this information is coming from Augustine, our main antagonist for the game. She wants the DUP to look good so that they can stay in business and maintain the public's trust while shaming Cole's memory to turn people away from conduits. Of course she's going to put the blame on Cole for using the RFI. She would spin that story to make Cole the bad guy even when he was trying to save the normals at the cost of his own life. We have no reason to believe anything she says. I might also mention that if this were the real reason, why is it only found in a DLC mission? A DLC mission that you can only get if you pre-ordered the game. You can't get this DLC anymore. Conduits existing is a huge part of Second Son, so why is it treated like an afterthought? Yeah, maybe it was because only people who either played the games before Second Son or people who were just really excited about the game would have cared enough to pre-order it. And if this is the real reason, why try to pass off a bunch of worse excuses along with it? Why is it that Sucker Punch in interviews gives the most lazy theories when in limited time DLC they give you the one that has the smallest holes in it? I'll tell you why. Because they wrote themselves into a corner from the moment this game was conceived. They finished Infamous 2 off with the tightest of bows. It was over. Humanity was saved. The conduits were gone. Cole was dead. A bittersweet ending that had little to no sequel bait. Believe it or not, they weren't even going to continue the series after the good ending. They were going to make a game after the evil ending. And why not? Cole was alive. He had all the power in the world. There were conduits to save and the entire world to fight back against him. That was going to be their next game. But instead, Sucker Punch changed their mind because according to the trophy data for Infamous 2, more players saw the good ending than the evil ending. How does that make you feel? Because more people played one side more than the other, that decided where the narrative needed to go. It didn't matter which one people liked more, it only mattered which one had been noticed. How does it make you feel to know that 36% of everyone who played Infamous 2 decided that for you? I didn't even know we were voting, did you? What about those of us who played both endings? Apparently our vote went towards making more money than making a smart narrative.